Hi everyone, this is Econ 2111 and 2175, and this lecture is an addendum to lecture number one. Essentially, there was something that I forgot to insert in the slides. As such, I am inserting it now. So this is a complimentary video. It won't be very long. As you'll notice, the number of slides is relatively limited, so don't worry, it's a really short topic. Okay, so essentially that addendum speaks to the best illustration of a counterfactual that exists out there that economic historians have relied upon. And that one is about railways in the United States during the 19th century. So what happened in from say the 1840s to the 1870s, there was the beginning of railways in the United States, but starting in 1870s, railways really took off. So they expanded really rapidly. There was a rapid expansion of the entire networks of railways in the United States. And there's a lot of economists who argued that when they were studying this in the mid 20th century, so close to not a century later, but a few decades later, when they were studying this, they said, aha, you see, the United States undergoes that great period of economic growth in the late 19th century. And at the same time, the railways are growing. Thus, because it happened at the same time, they assume that one caused the other, which is that railways caused economic growth. And you see some economists like Walt Rostow, so the guy that's mentioned here, argued that the big takeoff in economic growth in the United States has everything to do with railways. And that explanation went sometimes as far as to call railways indispensable for American economic history. Now, Robert Fogel is the man we want to know, and you're going to be quizzed on that, trust me. Bob Fogel is eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1993 alongside a guy called Douglas North. But when he was at the beginning of his career, he wrote a really important book that was called Railroads and American Economic Growth. And although he was doing his work in parallel to another guy called Albert Fishlow, who is somewhat forgotten today, Fogel went a step further. And he argued that no, railways didn't matter as much. They weren't indispensable to the American economy. And the way he proposed that this would be the case was he said, we need to imagine the United States without railways. And so what would that mean, comparing the United States with railways to a United States without railways? Now, there isn't a United States that exists without railways, so you can't exactly like do a lab experiment to assess the importance of railways. You can't like just do like you do for medical drugs, and you have a group that gets the treatment and one that gets the placebo, and then you check if the drug actually has an impact relative to the control group, blah 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 blah. But Fogel said, yes, we can actually do that. Not directly, but we can do that indirectly, which is that when the railways are open, they allow people to move in to new places, including places, say, as the Midwest of, not the Midwest, but the far west of the United States. It says they move in, it's because the railways make this possible. But if the railways hadn't been there, maybe people would have located in different places. Maybe they would have lived, more people would be in Michigan, where there's the Great Lakes. So there's navigable riverways that allow transport from there. And so the mechanism that Fogel proposed was that you could have a method that was called social savings. What was the cost of shipping something, right? A ton of whatever in train relative to the next best option, because people could have just shipped it on other methods. And that's the social savings approach. But Fogel went a step further and added that thing about population distribution. So the answer that Fogel gets is for 1890 that the economy was roughly 3% bigger because of railways. How did they do that? Okay, I've just told you the story. Well, look at the map we have here. In gray, right, all the areas in gray. So you see that there's white. This is the map of the United States. And you see the areas in gray is where there were railways and a 30-mile area around railways. So everything in gray. There's a few under grays that you're not seeing because they're under the black, because the part that Fogel was interested in was the black ones. The black lines that seems to stride everywhere on this are essentially navigable riverways. So this is where you could technically access places by virtue of using rivers, the coastline. So for example, you can see that the entire coastline of the United States, right, is in black. Why? Because everything on that line is accessible by water. From here to here, you can use a boat. So the argument that Fogel makes is that people could have located in these areas. And that offers the counterfactual. If there hadn't been railways, people would have used waterways much more. So here's how Fogel estimated the value of railways. He relied on a piece of theory that comes from essentially your pretty much standard micro class, which speaks to how factors of production, labor, capital, and land are remunerated. Now, labor and capital are somewhat mobile, and thus they can move and find their highest rates of return. But land is a bit different. Land is being paid as a residual. So its payment, and more precisely the returns on land, are determined only after the more mobile factors like capital and labor have been paid their competitive returns, which suggests something really neat, especially because land can't move. The income you get from land would capture the economic advantage of reduced transportation costs with or without railways, because the other factors, labor and capital, would earn the same. So think about it this way: land that is close to railways actually gain value because they have access to the railway infrastructure. They don't move, but there's this productive asset. Just by the way, as when you're in a house and you buy your house and your house is close to a school, well, that gives value to your house because you're close to the school. Well, what Fogel does is he uses this piece of theory on what determines land prices and essentially rent for land. He points out that if there had been no railways, the areas that were further away from waterways, because if there wasn't railways, people would have used waterways, these areas that are further away would not have been settled. So he points out that 24% of US farmland that was more than 40 miles away from waterways became uneconomical to settle without railways. These lands, he points out, were worth $1.9 billion. So that was the stock value of land. And if you estimate how much income they generated roughly 153 million. Now you add that 153 million to the cost, the extra cost, because hauling goods on waterways was more expensive than on railways. So it was more expensive to use water than rail, that's for sure. You add the cost of the land that wasn't open, plus the extra cost of transport, and you actually get an estimate of how much there was social savings from railways, right? So it's saved relative to the counterfactual based on waterways. Essentially, this is the same as saying the gains from having railways. Now, Fogel made some additional steps. He found that maybe the highest, so you imagine if more canals had been open, if there had been more investment in waterways. He makes a series of other scenarios to expand his counterfactual. And the maximum he finds is that railways, the social savings that they generated was at maximum, in his case, 4.7%. But he estimated it was probably closer to 2.7. Now, Fogel sparked a ton of reply. There is a lot of papers out there that actually tried to replicate this, and some of them find higher figure. I've seen some that go as high as 10% of how much extra gains to the economy came in. I've seen actually a working paper since I wrote these slides that came out. So it's not published as a scientific article yet, but it's a paper that's now being circulated publicly in view of being published in a scientific journal, and they find something much higher than 10. I think they're in like the 20 something percent. They just use a different ways of calculating the counterfactual. But if we exclude that new case that I found, the estimates is roughly around 7%, right? It averages mostly, it seems to average at 7. Now, what do we make of that 7%? Like, how big is 7%? Well, in the 19th century, 7% is 2 years of income growth. It's not huge, but it's not small either. Like, you wouldn't spit on 2 years of wage increases. But maybe a better way to see it is to do an exercise that a guy called Paul David suggested. And that exercise was, well, here is all the economic growth in the United States from 1840 to 1890. All that growth, some of it is due to more capital per worker, some of it is due to more education per worker. But of all of this, 1%, right? So if the growth rate is 3%, well, 1/3, so 1 percentage point of that 3 percentage point growth was due to technical innovations in other sectors than railways. Well, that included railways, but also other sectors. So steam engines used in manufacturing, iron, steel, refining for oil, farming technologies, reaping, a lot of new technologies, like overall, the entire spectrum of technical innovation. These innovations caused on average 1 percentage point increase in per capita income from 1840 to 1890. If we take the mean number of 7% for railways, it suggests that 1/7 of all the growth due to technical innovations was due to railways in particular. So alone, railways seem to be a big driver. Now, here you can see where I'm trying to get at as a counterfactual is all these guys who were responding to Fogel, and I've like cited a few, Liebergott, McClellan, Donaldson, Hornbeck. What they're doing is not arguing about the need for counterfactuals. They're arguing about the validity of the counterfactuals. They're saying, Fogel was right to do a counterfactual because it gave us an idea of how important railways were. But we need to go a bit further. So some of them will say that, no, actually, it's still good. That number he found is still pretty good. Some will point out that, well, maybe he undershot the result. Actually, Albert Fishlow, the guy that got forgotten to some degree, actually proposed a higher number. And he actually suggested that railways, while they didn't matter, they weren't indispensable, their contribution was not negligible. And so the debate is essentially on, is this the right counterfactual? Is there something else that we can do? Is there something else that we can control for? Are there better methods out there of creating a counterfactuals? And these debates are all about which is the correct counterfactual, but they always agree there is a need for a counterfactual if we want to know the answer to what is the causal importance of railways to American economic history. Well, if you started from Vogel's position in the 1960s when he was first writing, people were saying that it was indispensable. Notice the strength of the word, indispensable. Right? There was, if it wasn't there, nothing would have happened. Well, no, that's not true. It seems that the United States would not have been dramatically poor without railways, but they would have been poor. And so the debate is now you've noticed, because notice the way the discussion is framed is rather than debating whether they were indispensable, people are debating how negligible were they. And now that's a completely different topic. And here, rather than debating the need for a counterfactual, which the first question answered, the debate about the details of the counterfactuals are referring to this. So it's important that you know why Robert Vogel got known, but also because in this class, this counterfactual is something we're going to keep doing. We're going to keep creating counterfactuals to see what is happening, to understand the processes that we will be studying once we leave the theoretical portion in the class and approach the topics of economic history. So that's it for the little addendum. I'm going to wish you a good week on this, and everyone keep safe. Cheers.